please join me in welcoming Linus Owens, Associate Professor of Middlebury College. Tonight, Owens will be bringing to light the issues that face free speech on college campuses, giving us a taste of the first-hand experience of the challenges faced at Middlebury College during the 2017 protests against visiting controversial author Charles Murray, wherein his speech was disrupted by hundreds of student protesters. Now, as a professor of sociology, Owens thinks about movements, places, and the conflicts that bring them together and push them apart. He has brought these interests together in exploring how anarchists organize online, as well as the placemaking and storytelling practices of squatters in Amsterdam. Owens has also written a few books, two of which include the academic, Cracking Under Pressure, narrating decline in the Amsterdam squatters movements, and the popular Lost in the Supermarket, an indie rock cookbook, so pick this up and see more out. He also has a few projects still in development. He is creating works on how cameras and masks interact to produce a visual language of political protest, the cultural history of Halloween, and the complicating ways in which activists incorporate travel, movement, and space into their protest tactics. So keep an ear out for those. But that's enough from me. One more time, I would like to welcome Linus Owens, Coming Together While Coming Apart.
Thanks. Hi. That was nice. So y'all could hear him. Could y'all hear me? If I don't stand near the microphone, thanks. So thank you for that super nice introduction. Thank you everyone for coming. I know you don't have to, although I kind of hear that some of you do have to. So I hope that I'll at least make it somewhat worth your while, and I appreciate you listening and hopefully engaging with these issues with me as we move through them. So as was noted at the beginning, I'm here to talk specifically about what happened at Middlebury last year, but only as an opening point to raise some other questions or to have some other conversations with you. Because as much as it seems like at Middlebury we're the center of the world, I know that in real life probably what actually happened there may not be of huge interest. But I think it's important because it raises important questions that we'll have to deal with even not just on college campuses, but beyond. So So my talk's going to have three parts. So the first part, I'm going to talk with you about the specifics of what happened, tell you explain a little bit about who Charles Murray is, why there were concerns by students, and what form the protest took, and then particularly think about the aftermath. The second part of the talk will focus on some of the key phrases that became dominant in the way the protest was spoken about. Free speech is one of them, but others, including debate, marketplace of ideas, et cetera, that I'd like to explore and think about in the context of an actual existing event rather than these abstract generalities. And third, I'll have some kind of conclusions. I guess that's where we end. Some things that I think we, at least at the college, or at least I at the college, and some of the people I work with, students and faculty, learned from this process, or at least were reaffirmed in this process, and that maybe if I'm compelling or convincing, I can convince you are lessons that can be learned more generally. So I want to think about the historical context of when Charles Murray came to Middlebury. He came on March 2nd, 2017, which is approximately 6 weeks after the inauguration of Donald Trump. This is important because it frames the political context in which this happened. Two primary things I think are critical for us to remember is that just a couple weeks before, there was the implementation or the attempted implementation of the Muslim ban. And so this affects a lot of people, but particularly students on campus, saw this as the beginning of efforts to both attack immigrants or people, religious minorities, as well as more broadly targeted towards people of color, and seeing this as a move broadly of the administration. The other aspect is that 6 weeks after the inauguration, on the other side, following the Women's March and other protest movements, there was the air of, right, the framing of in terms of resistance. There was a lot of talk of like in the face of these kinds of moves, resistance was necessary. So this is the context in which this occurred. So a week before Murray's visit, came the actual official announcement. So there was not much time to prepare for this, but it was actually the Thursday before, whatever, February 26th or something, 25th, that we actually found out. And what needed to happen, and specifically Murray was coming to talk about his most recent book, which is called Coming Apart, The State of White America. But the concern by the students and faculty was not about this work, but by a previous work, which is called The Bell Curve, which was published over 25, I think, years ago, 20-something years ago, which makes a lot of arguments. But the key one that I want to focus on today was focusing on IQ as a measurement of intelligence, and then using that to make the argument that, or to put it bluntly, that black people were not as intelligent as white people. And so this work got a lot of attention when it came out. Coverage in mainstream media pretty much celebrated it without being critical. But within the social science literature, particularly sociology and some other fields, there are pretty serious critiques of the work, not just of the politics, but also the methodology, the way it was argued, that took it apart not just because of its racism, but because it was bad science. And so what happened in the weeks leading up to, or the week leading up to the event, is that students had to be both educated and educating on this issue. Because this was written literally before many of them were born. And so they had to get themselves up to speed to figure out what the problem was, and then be able to convey it to students who might not recognize it as a problem. And so within a couple of days, it became, through activist organizing, both in terms of the faculty and the students, became this pushback against Murray coming to visit, because the argument was that we shouldn't offer a platform to racists. That, and not just racists, because again, if we think about racism more broadly, that may exclude a lot of people, but people who argue racist points using bad science. That there's no place within the academy for people like that. And the pushback was, well, Murray's not even talking about this. So he's not even talking about race. He's talking about white people. This was actually the argument that was made by some people. And so, but right there. And so the students started organizing, and they organized in two ways. I mean, one is, it's hard to see this in the poster, but they started writing on this. This is Go White Nationalism is written on that, which is to create a website that provided information about Charles Murray's work. Because again, a lot of work had to be done just to both learn about Murray and teach about Murray. And across campus, you started to see information like this. I know this is kind of a wall of text. But basically, that printed out information that shared scientific critiques of Murray's work, that showed how it was flawed, again, to show that this was not just about his politics, although it was about his politics, but also about the fact that, again, by the standards of the academy, by the standards that we judge work, that he failed. And so the question is, why is he being brought to campus? Why are we providing, as an institution of learning, why are we providing a platform for someone like this? Well, the critiques fell on deaf ears. If you're interested in the Q&A, I can talk about all kinds of the nitty-gritty of what happened in that week leading up to it. But the most important thing that happened is that the college, rather than giving in to any demands of the students, they actually moved it to a different venue. They moved it to the largest venue on campus and created more space. And we can think about why they did that. But what happened when Murray tried to actually began talking is that most of the students in the hall turned their backs to the stage and then started reading a prepared statement together. Again, critiquing Murray's work, but basically making it impossible for him to speak. After, I think, 40 minutes or something, they moved to a different room and had he gave a talk that was covered online. But the initial talk was basically, for lack of a better framing, shut down. The media was very upset about Middlebury students. The conservative media in particular, but these are, I didn't want to sort of overwhelm you with headlines from the New York Times, but the New York Times was obsessed with it for a few weeks. And Middlebury became the symbol of everything wrong with intolerant students. And I want to think about particularly the editorial board, which wrote an op-ed that called them out for quote-unquote smothering speech. That is for denying Mr. Murray his free speech rights. And then the other part of the story, and this is Allison Stanger, a professor of political science at Middlebury, there was a confrontation after the talk where Dr. Stanger was injured. There's competing storylines around that, which I won't get into. But basically, it turned into this broader narrative of this kind of angry, violent mob that was conflated or treated as the same thing as the protests that happened inside, when in fact they weren't. But what I'd like to talk with you today about is a few fundamental concepts. So that's the basic thing that happened. People weren't happy about Murray. They went to the administration and said, we're not happy about Murray. We find it problematic in this moment to invite a racist on campus. The college basically said, well, there's nothing we can do, except the only thing we can do is to make it easier for him to speak. The president agreed to introduce him, and we see how important introductions are, and did a lot of things that students felt legitimated not just his presence, but his ideas. And so the protest happened, and the pushback basically originated around a concern about free speech. And when you read or someone says free speech, what does that mean to you? Yes?
Typically, it means something along the lines of a chilled peach, but in other occasions.
Freeze peach.
But in other occasions where it's used properly, it is legal and protection from legal action based on something you said. And you can't be arrested for saying something.
You want to add something?
Yes, I think free speech, it means like when any students or any people want to protest, like for example for human rights, they wanted to have like a freedom society.
You?
Free speech, it involves like having the freedom to say stuff and not getting punished with the law.
So let's think about this. I mean, there'll be other questions that you can answer later. What? All right, I know, but okay, great.
Don't you think it's important that we need to, as a society, that we need to distinguish the difference between the right to free speech and the right to hate speech? Free speech and hate speech are two different things, but a lot of Americans get them mixed up.
So I think this is important, right? So we can think about a couple issues, right? One is that free speech is not just something that the speaker has, but also that protesters have as well.
Or the listeners have.
The listeners have. And also, right, we can think about it as a legal concept as well as an administrative, right? Because often people will talk about the First Amendment, but when we talk about a private institution like Middlebury, or perhaps Landmark, right, where the First Amendment is not operative in the same
Free
way.
speech is that if someone feels offended that that word is being used in vain, they have a right to express that that is personally painful for them because it refers to something personal like themselves or a loved one, what they are being used in vain, and that it's okay to tell someone that that's painful for you personally. Because if you're not allowed to say that, that's not free speech either.
So one thing to think about is like who gets to speak and who gets to speak back.
Yeah.
Exactly. Thank you. And we'll get to this in a couple other points, but I want to think about a lot of people were concerned about the free speech of Charles Murray, but they often use it as a way to deny or complicate the free speech of the students. And the students' right to protest. And the question is, what happens when those rights come into conflict? Right? What happens when their right to protest is seen as silencing someone else's effort to use their free speech? And this is a sticky problem, and I wish we could solve it here. But I want to shift our attention to something else, which is the idea of attention, right? Which is because nowadays, especially with communication technologies, the way they operate, right? Like one of the things that we're really, like information is not something that's scarce. Speech is not something that's scarce. Attention is scarce. And so speech might be free, but attention isn't. And so one of the things that the students were trying to complicate in this, and not just students, but also faculty, but primarily students, was to complicate what does it mean to grant attention to someone? Because again, Murray has all kinds of speech rights. This was not a legal argument. This was about who are we going to grant attention to? And I want to get back to this question of sort of who speaks back. And we can come back to free speech, but I want to make sure we get through all of this. What is the purpose of debate? Yes?
I think the purpose of the debate is not to try to argue or fight against the law. The law, the law, and like they're trying to be protest against their human rights.
Yes?
I'd actually somewhat argue against that. I'd say that it's more the ability to see two different sides of one argument.
Okay, so one way in which we imagine debate is that there's two sides, right? And so, but the process of debate is to do what? To reach, someone's going to win, right? No?
It's not just
No?
I mean,
Then what do we debate for?
What's the definition of win?
Yeah. Isn't the point to seek the truth? Isn't that what winning means?
it's not just to find the truth, but what you actually is, well, it's just what you think it is. Which one is the truth or not?
So, I opened a,
Which one you're accepting or not? Or you're not accepting.
I opened a sort of a huge hornet's nest with it, asking for insight, which I'm totally interested in, but I want to get back, but there'll be time, don't worry, don't worry. But I want to think about, so what happens is this idea about hearing different sides, the importance of hearing the other side. And I guess the students, but also those of us who are supporting them, question whether there's a value in that. And question whether or not, right, sort of, that actually, whether they needed to hear that other side. And the other question is whether they hadn't already heard it. So when we talk about the idea of debate or the idea of attention, it's what is valuable for the student's attention? And I'm sure this is a question that's going through your mind right now, right? How do we value students' attention? And if it is to reach the truth, and maybe it's not, and maybe that's a limited way of thinking about winning, but whatever it is, the idea that debate, that both sides could have the possibility of prevailing. Otherwise, why debate? If you already know one side is wrong and going to win or going to lose, then what is the purpose of debating? Yeah?
The purpose of debating is to simply, it can be sometimes arguing aside and maybe having people come over, but it's really a matter of just kind of informing, getting your voice known, your opinion known.
So what does it mean when... So one question that that was asked about Middlebury students is, there are two things that were put on them. One is that why not just show up and then and debate Mr. Murray and show that he's wrong. And the second point was made the opposite, which is why don't you not show up at all? Right? If this is so painful for you, to use language that you talked about before, if this is so painful for you, why are you going? And so we can see already within the context of debate that the students are asked to do two different things. Either don't show up if it's painful for them, but also place on them the responsibility to challenge them. Because you think about like the students' experience that if no one else goes to challenge, then Murray's going to get off scot-free, and then they're going to be in class the next day with students who went there and heard the ideas of Charles Murray without having some kind of pushback. And so partially this idea of debate, right, at least the idea that the students and we were critiquing is that you already legitimate the other side by saying that we're going to debate them. And there's some things that aren't worthy of debate. There's a lot of things that are. And this is not an idea about shutting down debate. It's a question of like, what's the value of our time? Like, what should we be debating? And if we've already know what the outcome is, then why are we debating? Maybe it's so that voices get heard. Maybe it's to practice our arguments to make them sharper. But again, there's other ways to do that. It's not absolutely necessary. And so the question came, like, why are we bringing someone who's been known as to publish problematic science, racist ideas? Why bring him to campus? Is that the best kind of debate to be having? I'm ignoring you, but not maliciously. Because I want to talk about platforms. Because another thing happened that we see a contradictory response to the protest of Charles Murray. A lot of people argued that the students were de-platforming him. That is, you saw in the picture Murray up on the platform, but he was unable to speak. And so this is in some ways a classic version of someone being de-platformed, having their platform taken away. On the opposite side, the argument was made, and this was made most explicitly by Middlebury's most famous faculty member, Bill McKibben, the environmentalist. He wrote a piece in The Guardian that argued that actually the students had extended Charles Murray's platform. By drawing so much attention to him and giving him so much press, it allowed him a bigger platform than he had already. So again, on the one hand, the students argued that they were de-platforming him, and at the same time that they were granting him a larger platform.
Was that argument made to defend the students?
No, it was made to critique the students. It was to say that they actually, what they tried to do, they actually had the opposite effect. And while McKibben is a supporter of a lot of student activists, he was not a supporter of this protest. But the question is, right, what is the platform that belongs to students? I mean, the one thing that I wrote a piece with a couple of former Middlebury students in response to what happened in Middlebury to argue that the argument had quickly become this abstraction about free speech, platforms, debate, that was missing what actually the lived experience of the students on the campus. And not just students generally, but particularly students of color and other students from underrepresented groups. And what they experienced at being at Middlebury College in their everyday lives, but also what it meant for them that someone like Charles Murray was being legitimated. For them, the only platform they had was that moment of protest. For them, this was a place where they could actually use their speech. For them, they were invested in the fact that Middlebury was the platform that was theirs and that was being shared with someone that they didn't, not just disagreed with. Because I think, again, when we frame it in terms of debate, we easily turn it into both sides. It's a simple disagreement. But this is not just about a disagreement. This is about a fundamental right to ideas of equality and belonging. And in a place like Middlebury, and maybe it's a place like Landmark too, I don't know what the experiences are here, students of color feel like they don't belong. Sometimes that's actively produced, but it's also institutionally created. I mean, Middlebury has a very particular culture. It's kind of elite white people, which some people find hard to assimilate into or hard to deal with. But also there's a sense that certain people belong and other people are there because the college needs to be more diverse. That they don't merit their belonging in the same way that the normal Middlebury students do. And so this is a debate that already exists on our campus and other campuses. And so when you bring in someone who's making an argument that, that people of color have lower IQs than white people, then it confirms a problem that's already, confirms an ideology that's already operating on this campus that's making students feel like they're unwelcome. Yeah?
I don't believe that is true because for me, I've always gone, like I've been with white, not to like, but I've been with white people my whole life and I've still succeeded even though I may haven't. Like everyone at the school has an LD, but even with white people who don't have an LD, I've succeeded. I've found the help I needed. Like to get where I am. It didn't like it took effort. It took time for me. Like everything wasn't like I don't get anything really granted. My parents like help me, but I do everything on my own, and like that's just. And like I have friends like my mom goes to an elite. My mom works at an elite private school, basically all, and like she has kids from those private schools who are black, and they are smart as they get into like smart.
Right.
They get into Harvard, like all Ivy League, like
Right.
they get into that. Type
Absolutely,
of,
absolutely.
So like not all.
No, not all at all, right? But the issue is that this is a stereotype or belief that's not, that's fairly common at Middlebury. It's not true. And so what happens, so the concern is when you invite someone that reinforces this non-true belief, it's not just giving him a platform, but it's reinforcing beliefs that the college should be actually making steps to change. And it actually makes it harder for some of us who are teaching classes or working with students to try and change these ideas to bring someone like Murray in. And so the idea is like, whose platform? And what does it mean? Because the other thing that happens is that students, that the college is not just a platform for them. It's where they live. It's, they're attached to it in various kinds of ways, but quite literally, it's where they live.
What do they mean
I'm gonna pause, if you don't mind. I'm gonna bring us back to the format, so we're gonna hold Q&A until
Sure.
is done speaker.
Unless I ask questions. But hold on.
What does it mean by platform?
What does it mean by platform? So literally, right, a platform is like, this is like the opposite of a platform, right? Normally a platform raises you above, and that's where you speak from, right? But there's a metaphorical idea that people, that in order to exercise free speech, you need to have a platform, right? That you can talk all you want, but a platform is what gets you listeners. Does that help?
Not a literal platform that raises you, right?
Well, in this case, it actually was. But yes, metaphorically, the platform is sort of the structure that allows you to project your free speech to an audience. And so the question is, certain people have access to platforms and other people don't, right? Like, I have this platform here that I'm sharing with people and struggling to regain control over. Right? So this is the last thing I want to talk about, and then I'll sort of segue to lessons or conclusions. I want to think about comfort, because one of the other argument that came up, that comes up a lot around these issues, is that certain students are unable to have hard conversations, that they don't want to feel uncomfortable. That as soon as they feel uncomfortable, they bail, or they complain, or they try and shut things down. And again, at my institution, and I don't want to generalize too much about other ones, but I know at certain other ones that the people who feel least comfortable at these institutions tend to be people who are from the underrepresented groups, whether people of color or first-generation students or people from working class backgrounds, et cetera, that they're having uncomfortable conversations all the time. And placed in these situations. And so actually, the people who tend to value comfort tend to be people in places of privilege, right? comfort is a privilege. And one of the things that came out of the Middlebury experience, or at least the response, but not just Middlebury, but this broader, like especially 2017, there's a lot of talk about student protest and free speech, and this concern that particularly at elite institutions, like where do elite students get off talking about being uncomfortable? I mean, if you go to Middlebury College, it looks like kind of the epitome of comfort. Country club-esque, right? It's very pretty, like people have nice, it's like occasionally there's good teachers, good food, all these kinds of things, all the kind of trappings of comfort. But one of the problems when this debate became a national debate, when it became a debate about abstractions, that comfort became sort of synonymous with elite students, rather than thinking about the differences of experiences on these campuses. And not just elite campuses, all campuses, but particularly elite campuses, because they get framed as the most comfortable of all possible institutions. How could you be uncomfortable in this space? And another word that's here that we'll skip over is like, the kind of the way this group was disparaged is to call them snowflakes. And it's particularly fitting, right, today, as we enter winter. But the point that I want to make with all these conceptual frameworks is that, or these concepts, these words, is that when you look at them as abstractions, right, they become ways that were used to critique the students. But if you think about like how comfort actually operated on campus, if you think about how platforms were actually operating on campus, if you think about what debate means, because again, on college campuses, to act like we debate stuff all the time. In our classes, in our papers, all the time. In fact, it's people off college campuses that don't debate things. And once you leave college, you'll realize, this was either a really annoying part of your life or a really special part of your life. Because this is one of the few places where that happens. And yet, college students were framed as resistant to debate. And what the argument that I want to make and that we were making is that actually it was just certain types of debates aren't worth having. Partially because they have effects on people just by having to do that work. But also, and maybe more importantly, and maybe this is an issue that y'all will care about too, it simply wastes our time. Because if we go back to Murray's work was debunked before our students were born. Why isn't, by most objective standards, he should be drummed out of the academy. And yet here he is, continue to sort of get big speaking fees, have a platform, both literal and figurative in this case. And why do we have to constantly debate whether or not racist IQ science should be legitimate? It's been debunked, and it's just a waste of people's time, on one hand. And on the other hand, it benefits the other side because they're just asking questions. They get the platform to muddy the waters. And so when we talk about free speech in the abstract, when we talk about platforms in the abstract, we miss the fact that when power is unequal, when truth is unequal, that actually abstract desire to uphold the principles of free speech actually reinforces inequality. It reinforces existing power hierarchies. And the student protests and efforts around that, not just at Middlebury, but other places, are trying to challenge that hierarchy, which means oftentimes the legalistic framework that exists because of that hierarchy, seems like, what's the word? Well, it's a problem. And accepting it in some ways is already accepting defeat. So we won't talk about snowflakes. I just want to hit this, and then we'll have our lessons because I want to make sure that I'm done when I'm supposed to be. This is the way that we talk about it at Middlebury's campus right now. These are our current buzzwords. Engaged listening. Someone just got a big grant, like $1 million grant. I don't know. It was a big grant. To have this several-year program on engaged listening. And the president uses this term rhetorical resilience. Which is the idea that we should be able to have discussions. We should be resilient in the face of having hard discussions. And engaged listening is the same thing. We need to learn to listen to each other. But my critique of this system, right, is that it just reinforces the idea that this is a talk about ideas. It's just about ideas. And the argument has been it's never just been about ideas. Ultimately, it's about power. And if we think about it purely in terms of truth, I say truth matters, but power matters too. And these are both ways of sidestepping power. And what these do are reinforcing, these are arguments that are trying to get us back to the way things were. On our campus, or perhaps other campuses too. People want, because it was nice then. But the problem is, it wasn't nice then. The issue is, the things that weren't nice, a lot of people didn't know about. Or a lot of people didn't have the speech or platform to tell those stories. And so one of the things that came out of the protest is that people, students, faculty, community members, staff, created a platform to tell these stories that demanded an audience that had to hear it. So let's think about what we learned. I don't know. Let's segue. So actions have consequences. Of course actions have consequences, right? So like one of the things that the administration talked about following the protest is that if you protest, you have to be willing to be punished for it. Right? Civil disobedience, right, is only civil disobedience if you're willing to take the consequences. And the irony, I don't know if you think it's irony, I think it's irony, is that they use Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail to basically argue that they should be willing to take those consequences. I mean, they sidestep the fact that the letter from Birmingham jail was actually targeting white moderates who are unwilling to take a stand around racism, but that's another issue. But the second thing is, right, it's not just that actions have consequences, ideas have consequences. Ideas are not abstractions. In college, it's really easy to think that ideas float around in midair, and we bounce them around like beach balls, and it's fun, and sometimes we win, and sometimes we lose, and then we go home and we're friends at the end. But ideas, particularly ideas around racism, or sexism, or these other ideas, they have consequences, and they have to be challenged, because they're consequential. Right? And so one of the ways of reading the protest at Middlebury, the response at Middlebury, is what happens if we take these ideas seriously? And that means not treating them as pure abstractions. It means thinking about what are the consequences, and not just the consequences for the students who have to go to class the next day with people who heard the ideas of Charles Murray, but more broadly, what happens in the context of an American society in which we refuse to take seriously the context, how we talk about race, how we talk about racism, when we treat it as either a feeling in your heart, right, or something that people believe but is separate, but is separate from the outcome. So this feeds into that. The interesting thing, and again, at Middlebury, it was there's all kinds of ways in which we can learn from contradictions. Contradictions are exciting. They seem frustrating, but they're actually exciting when we confront them because they expose tensions within systems. One is the thing that we were told when Murray came in is that, again, framed it in terms of this academic debate, that we had to be willing to talk about ideas, et cetera. But the interesting thing that happened is the people who actually study race, or the people who actually live every day under racism, and sometimes that's faculty and sometimes that's student, their expertise wasn't recognized at all. And so, again, to me, this debate is both, this outcome is both contradictory and obvious and not surprising, is that expertise is only mobilized under certain conditions. And what was frustrating throughout this, and this dropped out, this was not part of the national debate, but it was a little bit because the students' voices were silenced. At some point it was the op-ed people in the New York Times or other faculty, and even when I wrote something, although when I wrote something I wrote it with students, the concern was that the students were silenced in this process. And we could, if we wanted to be clever, we could talk about how they were deplatformed, but we won't. But they were silenced in a way that also took away their expertise. That took away the stories about what they experienced on this campus and why it mattered to them. Why it mattered that Charles Murray was coming. And it wasn't just that he's a racist. Because the question is Charles Murray a racist? Yep. I mean, there's definitive proof. Is it in his heart? I don't know, but that doesn't matter. But the bigger question that the students were interested in was, was Middlebury College hosting Charles Murray racist? Hold on. And their answer was yes. And if the answer is yes, then the next answer is it's important to impose racism and racists. And I want to sort of, almost finish with this, is that non-racist is not the opposite of racist. In a racist system, non-racists allow for racism to be reproduced. Because racism is institutional. And so a lot of the framing around debate and free speech is framed from a non-racist, quote-unquote, colorblind perspective. And the argument that the students and faculty and others were making at Middlebury, but is not unique to Middlebury, is not just that racist and racism need to be opposed, but it needs to be opposed from an anti-racist perspective, and not a non-racist one. In fact, if we want two sides, the two sides are non-racist and anti-racist. That we can exclude racism and still have two sides. We can exclude racism and still have hard conversations. Not exclude racists. Maybe we can't yet exclude racism. But if we're going to exclude racism, then the first step is to exclude racists. Because we've heard those things before. Charles Murray actually didn't offer anything new. Nothing that anyone hasn't heard before. Nothing that you haven't had to push back against to sort of justify who you are and whether you belong. Truth matters, blah, 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 blah. But here's the selling point, right? The protest works. The Middlebury is a better place now than it was a year and a half ago. A lot of people will disagree with me, but they're my enemies, so it's okay. Because sometimes it's good to know who your enemies are. The thing that, when we talk about truth matters, what this event did is it showed people what side they're on. Because a place like Middlebury, and maybe a place like Landmark, wants to believe that it's one big happy community. And it's great when it is. But often the discourse or need to be a community means that we paper over problems within the community. And one of the things that Middlebury, and not just Middlebury, papered over is that there's a huge problem of belonging at a place like Middlebury. There's a huge problem of acceptance at a place like Middlebury. And that students of color deal with this all the time. And that only a few faculty knew that this existed. Because if you're not a certain faculty member, or if you don't teach certain types of classes, the students don't come to you and tell you those stories. They don't come to you looking for help. And so the vast majority of Middlebury faculty and Middlebury staff and Middlebury administration were allowed to believe, and not because they were cynical about it, but believe because that was their experience, that there wasn't racism at Middlebury, that these problems didn't exist. And what this event did is not just put us on the national news for a week, which is pretty exciting anyway, right? Even if it's bad news, right? It's still exciting. The president didn't think so, but that it changed the conversation. It changed the conversation not just about Charles Murray, because again, who cares about Charles Murray? I mean, people care. But it changed the conversation on our campus about what needed to change. Because until that conversation changed, the problems that a lot of people knew existed weren't being recognized. Could it have been done otherwise? Sure. But this was the opportunity. And the other thing that happened is they didn't just change the conversation, that new types of relationships and new types of communities were being formed through this protest. Students found each other, students and faculty found each other, faculty found each other, and are now working to try and make Middlebury the kind of institution that it always promised that it was. But wasn't. But it was allowed to continue because no one was calling it out. And so I've been on a couple panels around free speech, and I'm sort of the token pro-protest person. I think protest is always a good thing. Because even if you lose, because you learn from protesting, and the amount of work that the protesters did, it's phenomenal. It's phenomenal the amount of work that they did. And it's not just in organizing the protest, but reorganizing the community afterwards. Because one of the things, and this is another picture from the protest, I mean, if you look, and I'll stop here because I'm running up against my time limit. If you look at pictures of the protest, this is not an angry mob. This is actually a moment of really strong community building. the amount of work that went into this and the amount of support that came after it is actually quite unprecedented at a place like Middlebury, which, again, because it's, privileges, individual achievement is about hard work and all this other stuff, right? And that to the extent that we build community, it's over hockey games or something. But there's an enormous amount of community, and it's a community that looks quite different than the average Middlebury community. And more importantly, or maybe not more importantly, but I think pretty importantly, that the students were making demands about the kinds of institutions that they were promised existed, that were promised that the institution was going to deliver, that they weren't actually that they were not actually allowed to experience. And so the students were actually, again, making demands on power that said, this is not the college that we want. And they could just transfer, right? I mean, we all go through this experience. Why not transfer? Why not transfer? Well, especially when the issue is racism, there's not a lot of options in terms of transferring. And the other thing is, right, the idea is like transferring is an individual solution. Protest is a collective solution. And because the first step is in reconfiguring the community is to build a community that starts to look like the one you want. And I could go on, and I already have, but I'm going to stop because the time says I have to stop. So thanks for listening, and I think we're going to stop, and y'all, like the vast majority of you are going to leave because you just got class credit for it. But those of you who want to stay and Q&A with me after the break, I'm looking forward to it. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to write down questions, and how shall we start? Who wants to start? Guy in the front row.
So, in terms of debate versus protest, do you think that there's something to be said for the idea that a protest might not have been as effective due to the negative media coverage it got?
So there's a little bit of a catch-22 here, right? Because one of the things leading up to the protest, there are a lot of people both from faculty and other positions who are like, well, you shouldn't protest because then everyone will turn against you, right? And then, but the idea is like, so why did they turn it, right? So like, was it effective to the extent that there was this negative coverage? So there's two ways to respond to that. One is, as I said, that in the short term, I think it definitely had some negative effects. The semester following the protest was not pleasant. It was stressful. Students were being punished. There were all kinds of concerns around that. The other thing is there was concern from the faculty and administrative side that like all the bad publicity would be bad for the school. And so one of the ways in which it was bad for the school is that this concern that funders would quit giving money to the college. And that's important to colleges because colleges need money. But the other thing is that students wouldn't come to Middlebury. That why would anyone come to Middlebury that there's all these kind of rowdy, problematic, troublesome subjects, students. And in faculty meeting after faculty meeting, people would stand up and say, our reputation is ruined. This is the worst. But what happened is actually the opposite. And I don't want to make a causal argument because I don't have the data to make a causal argument. But what happened is actually the incoming class was larger than ever. Our yield, which is what they say, like the percentage of the students who you accept who actually attend, the yield was higher than ever, and that the composition of the student body was far more diverse than the average incoming class from Middlebury. Again, I can't make a causal claim. The only point I want to make is that the concerns ended up not being unfounded, but we ended up with the opposite outcome. I mean, I could speculate in all kinds of ways that make my argument work, but I'm not going to do that. But anyway, yes, it's negative. And yes, there were some backlash, but the point is like, we also wouldn't have gotten the good stuff if that I think came out of it if it hadn't gone that way.
So why those college students will argue against the law about when they're making about the different racist about intelligence and other intelligence and actions. Why those students are trying to protest?
Why?
Yeah.
Well, the reason why is because they were concerned that by granting a platform, right, by Middlebury inviting him in, that it said that he was a scholar that we should take seriously.
Oh.
And the argument against it, again, was not just that his ideas and arguments were racist, but that his scholarship was flawed. And so, at a place like Middlebury and a place like Landmark, right, where scholarship matters, like in order to become a professor or a teacher, right, you have to like produce something that looks like truth, however that works, right? That we have standards, and the question is, why can't we hold the speakers we invite to our campus to the same standards that we hold our faculty to? And again, we have racist faculty at Middlebury. I mean, just because, whatever, we have like American people. And so the thing is not excluding racists, but that his science was problematic and it was used to propagate racist ideology. And it was wrong. And it had been shown to be wrong. And so the argument is like, at a place like Middlebury where we have Bill McKibben, who's a big climate change activist, we don't invite climate change deniers. We wouldn't. Because it's like we at Middlebury, we've agreed that climate change is a real thing. As an institution, we've agreed that climate change is a real thing. And now we just debate like what we're going to do about it. And we wouldn't ask Bill McKibben to have to justify it, right? To stand on stage and like debunk a climate change denier because he's got more important things to do. And so why are we doing that with someone whose science is equally flawed? Anyway, that was the argument. Yeah, you? Sorry, I don't know anyone's names.
That's all right. Who's racist at Middlebury that's a professor?
I'm not going to name names here, but I'm not going to talk about intentions. What I'm going to talk about is that Middlebury, that there's you already have your follow-up question. That's cool. Let me answer the first one first, because I'm not going to name names because whatever. That's not cool, and I don't think that's the way to go. But I'm going to say that there's.
Isn't that the best solution to get rid of racism? To name names?
Well, I'll name names on campus. I'll confront people on campus. But I feel like here, like and you may be totally right, and like maybe email me. I'll send you a list of names. But the idea is, you're absolutely right. The confronting is correct. I feel like naming names here is not a form of confrontation that's productive. That on campus, absolutely. Because I think that, because the question is, like, who's in a position, right? So, like, the social science shows that, like, strangers confronting people over racism rarely works. And, like, to the extent that we're going to confront people over it, tends to be people who are either friends, family, or institutionally close. And so, if I give you a list of names and you do something about it, that is actually likely, this gets back to your question, but in a different way, it's likely to be counterproductive. So if I want to intervene around racism, then I intervene in a different way. And the second thing is, and this is, as a sociologist, this is my broader argument, that they're institutionally embedded within a racist system, and they benefit from it without being critical of it. I benefit from it too. I have a good life. I benefit from it, and like I try and work within that system and against it, but I'm not overthrowing it in particular kinds of ways. And so, so you want a racist at Middlebury? Linus Owens. We can start there. You have a follow-up?
So you said it's the institution, so the library is racist?
Your library? I bet yeah.
It's racist?
Yeah, I bet it is. I bet when we look at what books are in there, I bet when we look at systems, I mean, I can give you, like, I don't know about your library, but I can give you examples from the past few months about interactions between librarians and students of color in which the police were called because they were identified. I can actually give you a story about, which I can't because it's confidential, but like stuff that happens on Middlebury campus about who gets called, public safety gets called because they see in the library. And the weird thing is, like if you see a person of color in the library at Middlebury, to think that, like in a place like Vermont, who else are they besides a student? And yet, right? And yet the police get called. And so absolutely libraries are racist. Absolutely. And I could talk about this forever, but I just want to shift because I know you're trying to, and I'm not just changing the subject because you're asking hard questions. But there's a whole bunch of other people. Yeah, you?
Yeah, would you make the argument that the reason that we need to discuss and to debate with people who might have racist opinions or might not share popular consensus that among liberals is because if they keep holding the ideas to themselves and don't have someone to talk about and debate with them, that they might angry and they see all this feeling of diversity and inclusion, that they might reach out and attack and try to bring harm to them because they feel so isolated and furious that they feel all alone.
Well, possibly. I think that when we look at recent examples of violence, that I think we see the opposite, actually. We see a kind of lone wolf narrative, but actually they're embedded within communities that reinforce their beliefs.
Yeah.
And we can think about, like, what would it mean to challenge that? And I think that the hard part about this, especially from an intellectual academic, we're in college perspective, is that facts are not necessarily the most effective way to challenge that. And so when we think about the power of facts, as academics, we like to believe in the power of facts, but I think there's other things going on. And so one might make that argument, and I think we could probably find examples of that. But I think if we look at definitely the most recent examples of kind of extreme violence, that people may be socially isolated, but they're embedded within communities that reinforce those beliefs. And so if they had them challenged, again, I think if from proximity, that challenge could work. Like if their friends intervened or their family intervened, but having someone on stage spout off beliefs, and then especially someone who's been doing it for 30 years, and then have college students who just did homework to try and debunk them. I mean, I think there's value in that, but I don't think it's going to have that effect.
Yeah, and that's not what I'm trying to go for. But I was, but more like sort of approaching them, not by confronting them, but trying to get to know them through common ground that on something that we can all agree that we both share a common interest for, and then he or she might start to bring it up. How would we go about bring up their racism? How would we go about trying to get them to not so much change, but so much come to the inevitable conclusion that it's just what it is, and they can't.
Well, we're moving into a slightly different frame, and I'll give you a short answer, and then of course, but I think that sort of calling people out is really important, and especially our friends and our family, and because one of the things that we can think about is especially in the past few years, but it's not just the past few years, that as certain types of behavior or statements have become more and more normal, that normalization has an effect, right? That as things become sort of taken for granted or not seen as problematic, there's an uptick in them. And so if we, and I'm not going to assume, that we share values on anything, but if we do share that value, then I think it means calling people out and letting them know. Because there are, again, like I said, actions have consequences. And to the extent that they're not consequences, then people will continue doing them. And and the thing is, it's not about changing their heart. Because it's not about intention, it's about effect. We can't measure intention, right? So when this gentleman back here asked me who's racist at Middlebury College, I could name names, but I'm not going to. But I'm going to say, who helps to reproduce racist outcomes? I'm part of that. But and so if we think about how racist outcomes are reproduced and think about intervening there, it's not about changing people's hearts. Hearts follow. Yeah?
Did the students of color ever, come out and say what happened to them personally during this time? And if that was the case, were there ever any protections, groups or people just taking precautions in different ways during this time? And how is it now for the students of color on campus?
Well, that's a great question. And I'll give you a short answer, and there's a super long answer. But one of the things that happened is that when we talk about racist institutions, there was one student of color who was misidentified as being at the protest or the confrontation after the talk, and was brought into through the honor system. And even though like her phone, like, you know, and this is, y'all should be aware of this, right? She was tracked on her phone that showed that she was in the dining hall at that exact moment, but the public safety officer said he recognized her. Even though she had other, not just sort of electronic corroboration, but other friends who corroborated that she wasn't there. And so partly it's like, you know, the small number of black women on this campus.
Oh yeah, I'm the only one, I understand, buddy.
Right. Right? And like, you know, what it means to misidentify in that context. And so there was a lot of movement around that. Again, calling attention to the small numbers and what it means. And but one of the problems, I think, with when we asked the question before about the positive outcomes of the protest is that because the college was set up to deal with it as in a punitive form, right, to like punish students, that it actually made it really hard, both necessary to form those kinds of communities, but actually quite difficult. There were kind of choices made by the college that kind of separated individuals from each other. What's it like now? It's still a challenge, but I think that, as I mentioned before, like one of the important things that came out of this, why I think that it was ultimately positive, is that students of color had already found each other, right? Like it's easy to find each other on that kind of campus. But I think the other thing is that they found more faculty and more staff members that could serve as resources or allies, et cetera. Because one of the things, getting back to platforms, is that, you know, only certain faculty knew about what happened on campus. And like one of the things that happened in the aftermath is those stories got told more publicly.
Right.
Not necessarily just by the individuals, but they got relayed through faculty at faculty meetings, et cetera. So no one had the luxury of being ignorant of the problems that students face on our campus. And so there's still a long way to go. I was talking with a student recently in the past couple of weeks about even like as the demographics of the campus shift slightly, that the same struggles remain.
Right.
And so I want to be positive, but not necessarily optimistic.
Right, I get you.
So we're going to close on that note.
Oh.
Thank you. If you have questions, no worries. Just
yeah, but I can't stay too long because I have to drive from the Thank you for coming.